So when we're talking about the squat, we want to be thinking that the main muscles that are working, the glutes, okay, the big backside muscles that are working for hip extension. When we're at the bottom of that squat in the deep position, our adductors, they're the ones that are really pulling us out of that hole and getting us moving. And often that's where we get stuck, right at that bottom. So how do we improve that? The quads, of course, we're extending at the knee. So developing our quads, and then our core, having our core stability. When we're talking about our core, we're talking basically from diaphragm to pelvic floor. We don't want any flexion in that spine. We want it dead still. And we've talked about the breathing techniques in the previous videos. But what else sort of exercises can we do to kind of better understand the activation that you need to gain stability in that region? So we're going to start today with the GHD. The GHD really works on our glutes and our hamstrings. So let's follow me out here. So this is our GHD, our glute ham developer. Just as it says, it works your glutes, it works your hamstrings. Now we're going to set up today, for me, get it into position. We want to have our hips just past our thigh support so that we can get good flexion in the hip. Because then we're working extension. That roll in the squat is to extend at the hip, getting our glutes to work. So flexion and extension, working our hamstrings and our glutes in that position. We also talked about core. Okay, we want to stay rigid in that squat so that when we press against the floor, we actually move. Well, right now I'm doing an isometric hold, working glutes, hamstrings, and even low back, working that core to keep me still. Okay, this is another one that you can use to help enable that core. Now, I've got a lot of my weight close to the GHD. If I'm getting good at this and I want to progress this, all I need to do is put more weight further out, and that's going to increase the difficulty of this hold. Same thing when you're folding. If I put more weight, I can even grab weight. When I extend with weight further out from our center of gravity and our pivot point, the harder that movement gets, the more activation, and then therefore the more development I'm going to have. Okay, so that was the GHD. Works your glutes, your hams, and your core. But what about other exercises? Maybe you don't have a GHD. What else could you do to strengthen those same muscle groups? So I've got a few things set up here that I'm going to demonstrate different exercises. This is a safety squat bar. And so what that does, you can see it's a cambered bar, and it puts the weight a little bit further forward. So it's similar to a front squat, and it's going to push weight into the anterior, the front side of my body. That's going to put more stress on the back side, which is where we're training the glutes, the low back, the hamstrings. So safety squat bar, I'll demonstrate this. Coming in, nice tight core. We're just going to come down, push the butt backwards, getting a stretch in the glutes, a stretch in the hamstrings, and then a contraction. Push it back, and then forward. So this is a good morning. Now, if you don't have a safety bar, that's absolutely fine. You can do this with a normal barbell. It's just even more work when you do it with a safety, because it's bringing that weight to the anterior, making it harder on the posterior. So there's that. Another exercise you could do would be hip thrusts. Okay, similar. We're working extension at the hips. An example here, I can lay down, get my back supported on a bench, weight on our hips, and work extension. Flexion, extension. So working those big, same muscle groups, just different exercises that can train this. So depending on what equipment and what space you have available, you can work the different movements. That's hip thrusts. Now you can normally, these are big powerful muscles, you can normally get quite a lot of weight with this. You can also do it on the Smith machine. Some people like it on the Smith machine. But really, depending on what's available and what you want to do. So next up, we've talked about the glutes. Let's talk about the quads, those extensors of the knee. Well, anytime I want to train the quads, I need to get more flexion happening at the knee, therefore I'll have more extension. So one of the ways we can do that and still stay in a squat pattern is a goblet squat. So I can grab a dumbbell and squat position still, weight anterior, so it's more work on the posterior, coming down, elbows inside of knees, getting a good stretch. See the amount of knee flexion I have, I'm much lower than I would be in a normal squat. I'm going to work more, actually abductors as well, and more quads. Coming out of that hole, back down, trying to maintain rigid torso. And again, you can obviously do a number of different weights with this. I talked about the safety bar with the good morning, but you can also just do the squat with the safety bar. So it would look very similar, getting under, grabbing our handles, coming down. So this is a little bit more quad heavy because again it's cambered, the weight is coming forward onto the anterior. Another thing that we could do is elevated heel squats. Now you can do this with your goblet squat, you can do this with a normal barbell squat. But what we're going to do is elevate the heel. What this does is allows basically your tibia and your ankle to have more anterior movement, more flexion. So again, this is going to allow for a deeper squat, more knee flexion, and therefore more quad activation in it. So I'll demonstrate it with a goblet again, but you can do this with a barbell, you can do this with anything. Heels are elevated, slightly out, knees go wide, and now I've got even more activation in those quads. Another thing that you could try, again attacking the quads, is a Bulgarian split squat. Now, a Bulgarian split squat is basically a lunge with a high back leg. So it's in this position. I would advise you to try it, maybe even with balance first, like stabilizing you. Body weight, but obviously you can use weight to increase the difficulty. We want the ankle at the edge of a platform, coming down and up. So now we're getting a lot of that work in a single leg, working stability, and getting a lot of quad movement and emphasis. If you want to hold the weight, same thing. Just adding load to that movement. So there's your quads. What else have I got? The Bulgarian, working out adductors. Let's get a normal bar here. So how do we work those inner thighs? What if we are struggling at the bottom of a squat? Well, at the bottom, our pubis, so the bottom of our hip, is further away from our knee than when we're standing. As we descend, we're getting a stretch in the inner thigh, which is why some people struggle to get depth in their squat. They're too tight there. We're getting a stretch. Coming out, we're getting a contraction in that inner thigh. So how do we work it? Well, we can make it harder at that point. We can add a pause. So for a squat, just add a 2 second, 1 second pause at the bottom of your movement. Going down, nice rigid torso, pause, and back up. Down, pause, back up. So we're adding more time under tension and making it harder at that position, using the energy of the muscle, so then when we're asking to do the concentric phase, that extension, it's better, it's harder, and therefore creates more adaptation. The other thing you can do to, probably my favorite exercise to strengthen the inner thigh, is the Copenhagen side plank. So let me demonstrate that one. Now, typically the Copenhagen side plank is isometric. We hold that position. And that's great for strengthening at that joint angle. So what we do is we get the top leg, unlike a normal side plank where the bottom leg holds our weight, a Copenhagen side plank, our upper leg takes it, and this lower leg is just floating in the air. So this is working my inner thigh to contract isometrically and hold. We're also getting core activation here. Again, this is isometric, it's strengthening at this point. But in a squat, we're moving. So how can we replicate that same process? Well, let's do a hip dip. Come down and get a movement through contraction. Just touching that hip down and coming back up, we're getting a concentric action, just like we would in a squat, through that side plank. Now this is difficult. If you're finding you have pain in your knee when you try this, the regression on this, the way to make it easier is just to get closer to that bench. So cover your knee and still have it holding. We're still getting that core, we're still getting that thigh, but the lever is shorter, it's not as long, and therefore it's a little bit easier. Okay. How do we work our core? Now, I've given you some examples of that, but what about the application of a squat? We're having compressive forces on the spine, and we've got to stay stable without any flexion happening. If we get that shear force with flexion, we're likely to bulge a disc, have some low back issues. You should never get low back pump, like an increase, a tightening of the low back when you squat or deadlift. Okay, it should be straight, it should be isometric. You don't get that when you do a plank, so you shouldn't get it when you get a squat if your technique is perfect. Now, no one's technique is ever perfect. We are always trying to achieve perfect form. It's kind of like an exponential curve. If you aim for it, but you never quite get there, the more you practice, even the world's best weightlifters aren't perfect, but they're getting closer and closer to perfect every time they practice. Okay, so working the squat, how do we do that? Well, we can do weighted carries. Now, some gyms may have a yoke that you can carry. That's that big strongman lift where you lift up and you walk with the big cage. We don't have that here, so what else could we do? Well, we could do just a farmer's carry or a suitcase carry. I can grab a dumbbell or I can grab a plate, and this is going to be more applicable to a deadlift, but we're working grip strength too. Now I'm carrying weight as I walk around, and I'm getting this force trying to contract me, trying to have spinal flexion. It's lateral flexion instead of frontal flexion, but it's still flexion of the spine that we're inhibiting, we're trying to fight against. So we can do weighted carries. Another way we could work the core and really work our stability is add some instability to the movement. We add instability, we have to become more stable to deal with that. How can we do that? Well, we could use a tsunami bar. Now, we don't have any tsunami bars here, so I'm going to replicate this with some bands on some weights. So through this, we're getting a bounce. As I move here, these weights are going to bounce and create instability, making my squat a lot harder. Then I have to fight, I have to use my core to stabilize as I squat. Coming out, you can see the wobble that this has as I move. I have to then brace and come up, and you see that bounce. That's really hard on the core. Of course, I'm a little bit stronger than this, just 95 pounds.
Paused. Okay.
Huh?
The video got paused for a while.
Yeah,
but you're good now.
Good?
Yeah.
So you can understand that this is going to increase the demand as you do it. Did it see it?
Yeah, I think you can do like another one more time.
Another rep?
It paused for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, this might be a little light for me, but you can understand how it's much harder to stabilize than just stagnant weight. Alright, the last thing we'll talk about with the squat would be the hip aeroplane. Now this really again is a stabilizing exercise. Can we control movement in different planes as we do a flexion and extension of the hip? So a hip aeroplane is in a one-legged position. We'll see how good my balance and stability is here. Coming down, opening for abduction, and closing, and even adduction, and back up. So that's a hip aeroplane. We're working inner thigh, outer thigh, with internal and external rotation, maintaining our balance through flexion and extension at the hip. So I probably named 10 or 15 different exercises there that you can do in addition to just your normal squat that will benefit and translate into that higher squat potential. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about the bench. Very similar. Actually, what about the weak points? I mentioned the pause squat. If we're struggling at the bottom of the squat, we can pause at that point where we're struggling and add the demand there, okay? Obviously, you won't be able to do as heavy weight. Drop the weight and work the technique, but having a pause at the bottom. What else could you do? Well, you could, very similar to a pause squat, you could do a box squat. Okay, so let me demonstrate that. I'll do it right here with a goblet squat, but you can do it with barbell squat. You can do it with safety squat, safety bar squat. It's really up to you and what is available to you. But here's the goblet variation. I've got the box behind me. I'm going to go down, pause, come back up. Now the key here, and what you'll see everyone do unfortunately, is as they go down and pause, to initiate the start of this movement, they're going to lean forward. Now that's defeating the purpose. When you lean forward, and we add flexion in the hip, we're then pushing it onto our more quad activation. The point of this exercise is we want to work the adductors, where we're at the bottom of our squat, where it's difficult to get out of the hole when we're at the bottom. So when we're going down and we pause, put our weight onto that box, we want to not move forward at all and come back up. So you want to have a look at the side view. Coming down, take the weight off of your legs, put it onto the box, and then come back up without the rock forward. What you'll see a lot of people do, rock forward, and it makes it a lot easier. Okay, you can't do that in a squat. You've got heavy weight on your back, you can't lean forward. So replicate what you're going to feel when you do that in the movement. Try to be as vertical as possible. Don't let that forward rock occur. If you're struggling to lock out the squat, it's unusual. You don't really see this as an issue, but I want to cover it. How can we increase the demand as you move through that squat, as you extend and stand up? How can we make it more difficult to really train our ability to get to that standing position? Well, an easy way would be to use bands again. Okay, so let's take this off and we'll add in, these are just light, I think 20-pound bands. They're not too much, but enough to create more difficulty. I'm not doing it as a demo, I'm not doing it with any weight, but you can easily add 135 or 225, 315, depending on your strength, to this band. Now you can see as this descends, you're going to have less stretch on the band. It's not going to really pull at all. As you stand up, the band's going to stretch more, it's going to pull more, and therefore ask more of the body. So it's going to help us train the lockout of the squat. Come back, we're going to work stability, because the bands are going to bounce a little bit. Coming down, nice and easy. You can see there's almost no tension here in the bands, and as I come up and extend, the bands engage again, making it harder to lock out. So if you're struggling, really pushing through, try banded squat. It's always a good variation.